Hi, and welcome to this video for PROG1198. The topic that we're looking at today is dynamic filtering procedures. So let's get started. Our goal with dynamic filtering is we want to be able to return a data set that matches one or more criteria. So our first job will be to determine or decide how data is going to be filtered. We might want to filter just on one criteria. We might want to filter on multiple criteria. We have to decide whether we want things that are returned to fulfill all of the criteria or any of the criteria. You decide whether you want to choose and or. And we also can decide whether we want to turn certain parts of the filters on or off. The purpose of this is to reduce the size of the data set. So when we're getting data from the database and displaying it via a collection in the app, we basically have two choices when it comes to filtering data. We can return everything from the database and then use our C# code to pare down the data set, or we can retrieve a subset of data from the database and then just display that. So in your C# course, you're going to be covering filtering of lists and determining how to filter data sets based on various criteria. So in this class, we're going to look at the other side, where we retrieve a reduced size data set from the database. Another important time that you want to retrieve a reduced data set is when you're working with a lot of data. So if you know that you are going to only be retrieving a subset, or that you know you're going to be applying filters, it's better to do that off the bat when the alternative would be downloading hundreds of thousands of records. So we want to be able to provide a responsive, well-organized interface where users can enter their filtering requirements. In our case, I'm also going to show you how to bypass or ignore certain filters. And our first step is to write a stored procedure to accommodate these requirements. So similar to our last video, we're going to be making changes across the board. We're going to be making changes to our database, and then we're going to be writing methods that access these new stored procedures via our code library. And then finally, we're going to be updating our user interface to interact with the new functionality that we're building. So we're just going to go step by step, starting with the database. So the example that we're going to work through is filtering the employee data. Now, most of our examples have used departments, although I did do an example for employees last time. But this time, I want to practice filtering using employee data just because we have more data to work with in the employee table. There's more different data types and different kinds of columns that we can work with. So we're going to do our filtering example using employees. Our goal is to add flexibility to the select procedures by adding lots of filtering options. So we're going to look at three different filtering situations. Filtering by a foreign key. So for example, showing all the employees that work in a particular department. The second one is filtering by text strings. And we have four different options there. You can do a contains match, starts with, ends with, or exact match. And finally, we can do between a range of values. So if we provide a starting value and an ending value, we're looking to match all employees between that range. So for example, if you want to list employees whose salaries are between $50,000 and $80,000. So we're going to look at all three of these in this example. Let's start with foreign key lookup values. So when the parameter is set, we want to filter a field using that parameter. The goal here is to filter employees by departments. So department code is going to be what we're using to filter employees by department. So I'll bring up our employee table here. You can see how employees have this foreign key for department codes. So from the user interface point of view, they're going to have a drop-down list or a combo box of department options. And they will pick a department, and then the interface will respond by showing you all the employees who work in that particular department. So our select statement is going to look something like this, where we select everything from employee, where department code matches some parameter. Now the parameter that we pass in has to be one of the given department codes. So we're going to use what we learned in the last video about creating an ordered list procedure, and we're going to get ourselves a combo box full of all of the different possible department options. The user chooses one, and we're going to get the selected department code from there, and we're going to pass it as a parameter, which will eventually make its way over to this stored procedure. But what happens if the users choose to bypass the filter and they want to see all of the employees? Well, the way that we would do that would be we would have to provide some kind of alternative value for the department code. For example, if we pass a value that doesn't exist in the data, we can look for a matching value, something like this. Now, this statement would only work when this flag value, indicating bypass the filter, doesn't appear in the actual data. So if it's possible to have a department code that has 4 X's as its department code value, then this whole thing will break down. Presumably what we would do to get around that is to put a constraint on the department table saying that this is not a valid department code. So this is just one solution. Another option is to pass an empty string here. So if department code is empty, then it will show all departments. And if you're not quite sure about that, I'll just prove it by typing it out. Let's declare department code as char4, and we're going to set department code first to an actual department. So if department code is ACCT and we execute all of this, it's going to show us all the employees from the accounting department because department code is going to equal ACCT. The OR statement says, does ACCT equal the empty string? That part is false. So it only returns records for this part being true because we use an OR. Only one of them has to be true. Now, if I leave it empty and I execute all of this, you can see that it does show all employees. The reason why it shows all employees is because if the department code is empty, what happens is it says, show us the employees where the dep code value. So let's just replace this with an empty to illustrate it. And we know that this isn't going to be true for any of them. But now if dep code is empty, then this side of the OR is true for all of them. So that's a little trick to make that flag work. And we can bypass our filter by passing an empty string in as the department code. So that works out well as long as we have the rule that says employee department codes can't be blank. Now, if they can be blank, then again, we might have a problem here. So you need to choose a flag value that would never appear in the actual data. If the foreign keys are numeric, most of the time they would be identities. 0 works well for that. So that's the logic that we're going to encapsulate in our stored procedure. So I'm going to write a select procedure that includes the input parameter for the filter. I'm also going to make sure that we follow all of the other good stored procedure practices. So I'll just pause while I type the rest. Here we go. So here's our select procedure. I just need to do some batching here to get rid of that red line. Where we accept an input parameter for department code, we're going to use that empty string as the default so that if we don't pass anything for department code, then rather than using null, it will use empty. That will allow it to bypass the filter. I've selected all of the fields from employee. If you have a view that does lookup fields and things like that, that would be preferable. I didn't create one earlier, so I'm not going to switch over now. We set no count to on for select procedures, and this procedure is all ready to go. I'll scroll over. You can see there's dep code at the end of that list. So let's create our procedure. And then I'm going to use an exec statement to test it out. So if I call this procedure without any input parameters, then it shows us all 8 employee records. And if I call it with a particular department code, then it only shows us employees from that department. So it looks like our procedure is working well. Now, our next step, the second type of filtering that we're going to look at, is filtering by text. So this could be useful on any of the text fields that we have. So emp first, emp last, emp title. You could use it as depth code, but typically we wouldn't do something like that on a foreign key field. So we can define an input parameter representing a matching value or a partial matching value, and then we just have to determine how we want the incoming parameter to match. So we can perform a contains match, where the parameter is found anywhere in that field by appending the wildcard before and after it. Or we can do a starts with match, where it starts with the parameter and then there's a wildcard just at the end. Or we can look for ends with by starting with the wildcard and ending with the parameter. Or if you want to look for something that matches exactly, just you can use an equals symbol, or you can use the like operator without any wildcards. So that is how we would format our where line. Now in our example, what we want to do is filter by last name. And I'll do a contains match so that if we type anything, even just one character, let's say for example, I typed the letter A, it would give us a list of all employees whose last names contained an A, anywhere in the employee last string. If we wanted to do something different, we could do like employee last names starting with A, for example. So I'm going to add this on to our existing procedure. I don't want to make 2 different procedures because I want to have these filters accumulate where I can choose to apply both. So for example, if I want to see all employees in the accounting department whose last name contains the letter Z and apply both filters, I have the option to do that. So I can only do that if they're both in the same stored procedure. So when we create the stored procedure this time around, I'm going to alter the existing procedure and just add on the parts that we need. So I'm going to add a second input parameter to take a value representing the employee's last name, just a partial match. We want to make sure to include a default value. And we want the default value to make sense so that the filter can be bypassed. Now we've already bypassed the department code filter using that empty string. And for the employee last name, you can see how I'm using AND logic to apply both filters. The employee last name is like the wildcard plus the value that we pass plus the wildcard. If the value that we pass is empty, then our like statement would just be 2 wildcards, and that would still match any last name. So let's take a look at putting this into our SQL statement. I'm just going to alter this procedure to add on our second parameter. I chose 30 as the size because that's the maximum length that a last name can be. And I chose the empty string as the default so that when I come along here and add my AND command here, just get it to line up. We're going to say the employee's last name is like a wildcard followed by the parameter followed by another wildcard. So if this thing happens to be empty, then it would turn into something like this, emp last like that, which matches every last name because this is nothing but wildcards in here. So that will allow us to bypass it. If we don't want to search by last name, all we have to do is leave it blank and it will show us everyone. So we add the input parameter, we add the second clause to our where line. I'm going to execute this to change the stored procedure in the system. And now when I execute it the second time, you can see that this parameter is optional. If I leave it out, it'll still work to just show me everyone in the information systems, because that's the name of the department code that I passed. If I want to be more specific, I can look for last names containing the letter O. So let's search for employees in information systems whose last names contain the letter O. So the Jones, Albertson, and Horton, all three of those last names are all going to be part of it. Ethan Black here is going to be removed from the data set when I execute this. You can see how that works. Okay, so now we have two different types of filtering that we can do. And we can choose, to bypass one and just use the other. So if I pass an empty string, or if I pass null, it will be assigned to the empty string. This will do employees from any departments whose last names contain the letter O. And we still just got 3 here, oddly enough. Let's try it with some different employee data. Last names containing the letter A. This illustrates it a bit better, that it shows us everyone who has an A in their last name, regardless of which department they're in. And if we just want to show various departments, we can fill in one or both or neither of the filters. Okay, so the two important things to remember are to pass input parameters for each filter and to use AND logic to apply the filters, but make sure that it also works with default values to include all records. So the default setting should be to just show everybody. Now let's take a look at the third option. We're going to look at a range of values. So if we have a range of values, what it means is we're going to have a low point and a high point, and we want to find everybody who falls in between. So this only works for numbers and dates. Like I mentioned earlier about finding employees whose salary is between $50,000 and $80,000. We need both of those values, the upper bound and the lower bound. Now, if the user chooses not to enter the lower bound or the upper bound, then we should, by default, show everything. So if they leave out both, it means show everybody. If you just leave out the upper bound, then it means show us employees who make between $50,000 and the maximum. So we can use it like an above. And if we leave out the lower bound, it would be employees who make from 0 to the upper bound. So we can be very flexible with this. Now, our goal here is to make this thing as flexible as possible. And we want to allow the users to leave it empty, but we don't want to have them pass null. So the way around this is we're going to accept the input as text, and then we're going to convert to the appropriate data type after. So this would allow the user to not choose values, because if you're entering something like a number or a date, you can't pass an empty string there. It doesn't work. So we're going to pass it as a string, and then we're going to convert it to a number or a date later when we need to. If the parameters are empty, we're going to replace with appropriate min or max values, and then after that, cast or convert the parameters to the correct data type. In the where clause, we're going to use the between operator. So let's take a look at how something like this would work. We're altering the procedure to add 2 more parameters, one for the lower bound and one for the upper bound. And in this example, we're going to do the dates. So the employee's start date between a set of 2 dates. So we have basically 3 or 4 different outcomes. Either the user didn't specify any dates, and therefore we're going to go from the beginning of time until the end of time for all intents and purposes here. The other option is if they didn't provide a lower bound, but they did provide an upper bound. So if they didn't provide a lower bound, we're going to set this starting point as the lowest possible date. If they didn't provide an upper bound, we're going to set this highest possible date as the upper. And if they did already provide values for those two, then neither of this is going to happen. So once we make sure that we actually have two valid values for dates, then we can cast them into date times. Or data types is what I meant to say. So we'll have two variables that are both of type date, one for the lower bound, one for the upper bound. And then when we add the final and, all we need is to say between one and the other. So if we have like a timeline here where we have date 0 and we have date 9999, you can't go any lower, can't go any higher. So this date 0001 is the lowest possible. So if the user enters something for the lower bound, then presumably it would be somewhere around here. And if they enter something for the upper bound, it might be around there, and we're looking for data in between. Now, if they didn't enter an upper bound, then we're going to set the upper bound as high as possible, and we'll be looking for data all the way up to the end. Same goes if they omit the lower bound. So we're just doing a between a low date and a high date. So I'm going to add this part to our procedure as well. Okay, I'll just make this a little bit larger so we can see it all at once. Here's our completed procedure. So we have now 4 input parameters, all of which are optional. We have some if logic to set the lower and upper bound if the user hasn't provided it. Then we cast it to a date data type after the fact. And I add the final and to include the between on the correctly typed elements. Okay, so I'm going to execute this. And we'll see how this filter is applied. So if I leave out the date options, you can see accounting employees whose last names contain the letter A are listed here. If I add the two dates, only show me employees who were hired during 1990. Oops, so from 1990 January 1st to 1990 December 31st. So it should show us this record, but not Lisa. So we'll try that. That's the expected outcome. Now, if we remove the other two parts of the filter, it will show us all the employees who were hired during 1990. And you can see there are 2. So we have this ability now to show employees between a range of dates. Now, if we want to show all employees, we can pass in empty for all 4 of these parameters. And we can see that it shows everyone. So now that our stored procedure is complete, we can move on to the part where we use our stored procedure in the app. So this procedure is going to take place of something that we might have written earlier called employee select all. Now, we didn't actually have a page on our site that shows all employees, but if you're replacing a typical select all with select by a filter, then all you would need to do would be to change the name of the stored procedure, provide values for the parameters, and nothing else would really change. But because we haven't done this particular service before, we're going to have to write this method. So the data layer method that executes our stored procedure for listing employees is going to be almost identical to the one for listing departments. So let's take a look at that right now. In our company table, or our company file rather, we have this method that we had used to get all departments. where we run a select statement that returns multiple records. We run a query with that statement and assign the results into a list, and then we return the list. So we're going to be doing something very similar to return a list of employees. So I'm going to copy this to start, and we'll change employee to department. And we're going to replace employees with departments. There we go. So this would have been what we were starting with if we had already listed a bunch of employees. But now, rather than just listing everyone, we want to filter employees. So I'm going to start by changing the name of this method to indicate that we can filter employees here. In the SQL, I'm going to put in the name of the stored procedure. And we also know that we're going to have to set up some input parameters. So our stored procedure takes 4 parameters. We learned in the last video how to create a collection of parameters by creating these dynamic parameters bag. And we're going to add 4 parameters. So the parameters that we add here, just going to move this over to the side, and we're going to go here on the other side. The parameters that we add in here need to match the names of the one that our procedure is expecting. So our first parameter is going to be dept code. And where are we going to get it from? We're not getting it from any particular employee or department. Where it's coming from is the users typing it into the user interface or selecting it from some combo box that we're going to make. So this is a little bit of a departure because here we know that this method is going to need to accept the locations of those 4 different parameters. Where are they coming from? Well, ultimately they're going to come from the user interface. So when we call this, we're going to pass in those 4 values. Now keep in mind the data types. We've got char and varchar for all of them. So I'm going to use string for each one. I'm going to take an input parameter for the method that will allow us to send these. So I'm going to say we're going to take a department code, and we're going to take a last name, and we're going to take a low date and a high date. And I am naming them the same, but because we're not having an object here, we could have like an employee filter dummy object. Object-oriented purists would do that, but to keep it a little bit more simple, I'm just going to take the 4 strings as the input parameters. So we'll have those 4 things, and we're going to assign them like that. And I'm going to do the same for all 4 of them. So I'll just pause the video while I type the other 3. So here they all are. These are the values that are coming in to the method, and they match up with the names of the parameters that we're going to send to the procedure. Now remember from the last video, they don't actually have to be named the same in this case. When we specify the parameters manually, then they can be named whatever we want. But, you know, for the sake of continuity, I'm going to name them the same anyway. Okay, now, when we create the list, we need to send not only the SQL statement, I'm just going to stretch this over a little, but now we have some input parameters to send, so we add that. And also, if you remember from previously, whenever we call a stored procedure, instead of passing inline SQL, we need to say that this is a different command type, that it is a stored procedure. So I'm extending that query to there. Okay, so our method for filtering employees is all done. So now the final piece of the puzzle is creating the user interface. So over here I have an example of a user interface where the user can provide values for those 4 input parameters. So we're going to add user controls to our application so that the user can select their filtering options and view the resulting player list. So for departments, because it's a foreign key lookup, I don't want the user just typing anything. I'm going to provide them a list of valid departments to choose from using the ordered list procedure that we learned in the last video. I've got a simple text box for last name partial matches. And then here I've got 2 calendar date pickers for the low date and the high date. I have a search button that the user can click on when they're done entering all their data. They can click on search to get the results. I'm going to put a list view down here in this area that will list all of the employees. And when I click on the reset button, it's going to clear all the filters and reset to display all employees. So the default behavior that we want before you filter anything or after clearing the filters is showing all of the employees. Now, in our company solution, if we wanted to show all employees, we know that we need to pass 4 empty strings to our stored procedure. So if we wanted to call this but pass 4 empty strings, that's kind of a funny sort of thing to do. So I'm going to show you in a little bit how to get around something like that by writing a helper method. But for now, we'll just leave it as is. Now, the page that we have been working on for our user interface, I'll just open it up. It has a lot of stuff on it already. So we've got all of the department things that we did where we were searching for departments and adding them and updating them and deleting them and testing them and all sorts of different things. So this page is full. And what I'm going to do for the user interface to search and filter and display employees is I'm going to create a different page in my user interface app. So this is something that was part of the extra supplemental materials in PROG1198. It wasn't required, and it's not required now. I want to make that clear. You do not have to do this, but as a slight tangent, I am going to just display how to create a second page. So we're going to right-click on the name of our project. I'm going to go to Add and a new item, and we're going to add another page. So we'll get blank page. I'm going to give this thing a name, and the name that I'm going to give it is Employee Search. When you name your new page, make sure that you don't name it the same as anything else. So, I wouldn't want to call it employee because I have an employee class in my data library, and I don't want to get myself into a situation where I have to specify which one I want every time. So, you can do that, but it becomes a pain. So just name it something unique, and we'll click Add. I'll get a nice new blank page. Now, the very first thing that I want to do is make sure that I can actually get to this page. When the app starts, it starts on main page by default. So I'm going to add a little button or something that we can click on to get over there to the other page. So I can make a button or a link, but those have kind of been done to death. So what I want to do is I'm going to use a text block, actually. I'll just drag it and we'll put it over here somewhere in this area where it's not going to infringe upon the rights of any of these text boxes or anything. I'll pause the video while I move it into the right place and color it and things like that. All of that stuff is stuff that you already know how to do, so I'll just pause during that part. Okay, so I've moved my text block into an appropriate place. Right here, I made it say Employee Search. I turned it green because the rest of my app is green and I think it looks cool. You can turn it whatever color you want to. It doesn't matter too much. But I've made an event on this text block, and that's something that we haven't done before, or that I haven't demonstrated before anyway, because when you have a button or another interactive thing like that, it's typically a click event that we're looking at, but a text block doesn't have a click event. It has a similar event that is based more in like a touch environment, and the event is called tapped. So, think of like tapping it with your finger on your phone screen, You can make a tapped event on a text block. It's not the default event. If you double click on a text block, you don't get a tapped event, you get a different kind of event. So if you want tapped, you have to either get it from the properties window or, code it in the XAML. I'm just going to enlarge this so we can see that better. If you scroll over, tapped is the name of the event, or you can get it here from the properties. Just go down and we can make an event for when you touch that. And if we go to the event handler, all we want to do is navigate over to our new page. So we're looking at the changing the frame.navigate. And it's asking us what type of page we want to go to. Oddly enough, it's kind of a funny way to put it, but we can get the type of employee search. So we tell it navigate to a page that is an employee search data type, and that will send us over to the employee search page. We can test this out. So here's the app when it first loads, and you can see my employee search text block over here, and when I click it, we go to the other page. Now the other page is blank. We haven't added anything to it yet, but that's a good start. We can make sure that that action works. Now let's move on to working on our employee search page. I want to create this kind of user interface. So I'm going to pause the video while I create all of these controls. Lining up controls on a page is something that you already know how to do. So I'm not going to waste time in the video explaining how to do that. We'll just skip past that part. So here's our user interface for this employee search and filter page. I've got my department combo box here called CBO department. I've got a nice grid lining everything up. Got some buttons here for searching and resetting. And down here underneath employee results, I've created a list view. Inside the list view, you can see that I have created a whole bunch of text blocks that are all bound to the various employee fields. Now there is one tiny change that I did make. You might notice that instead of emp start, you see emp start str. Because one of the things that I want to do to make the user interface better is changing the way that the start date is displayed. Remember I mentioned earlier how the starts in the database, they're just dates. But in C# we don't have an object for just date, so it becomes a date time. And that means when I display emp start, it shows the date and it shows the time, which is 0 o'clock for all of them because there's no times in the database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another property in our employee object class called employee start str, which is short for string, where I take that start date and just format it and return it like a string. So I'll do that little piece now while we're thinking about it. We go into our employee class, and I'm going to just add one more read-only property. Oh, I got my caps lock on here. Public string emp start str, which will return a short date string representing the employee start date. It'll show the date only. And because it's read-only, I don't have to worry about it affecting our query method reading and creating our employee object. So that's not going to mess anything up as long as we keep it read-only. It doesn't have a set block, so we're good to go. So we use this lambda notation here just to shorten it up. This is what the get block would be. Okay, so now instead of displaying the date time emp start, we're going to display the string version of that as a short date. Aside from that, everything else is just mapped normally. We could do the same thing for other fields if we wanted to. If we wanted to display the salary like formatted in a currency format, there's lots of different things that you can do. If I told you about it forever, this video would be 100 hours long. Okay, so we've got a good user interface going here. What we need to do is code these two buttons, search and reset. We also need to code the page loading action so that when the page starts up, it starts by displaying all of the employees. So let's get to our code behind and we're going to start coding. So I'm going to create the click events for both of these buttons. And we have our constructor here that executes when the page loads. So when the page loads, we want to retrieve and display all employee records. And in this one, we want to retrieve and display matching employee records. And here, we just want to clear the filters and reset the employee list. Okay, so we've got a little bit of work to do here. Now, just like in the other page, we need an object to represent our code repository or our data layer or whatever it is that we want to call it. If we look back at our main page example way up at the very top when we first started, remember that we had a reference to the database, and when the page loads, we create that database reference by connecting. We'll have to do that again on the other page because we've gone out of scope of this one. So that's going to be our first step, is creating that reference. So we want company, and you'll notice we don't have the type or namespace. We can apply it via the using statement. So we want to add using company library, just like we did in the previous one. It's been a while, so maybe we forgot, right? But we need to import that library, and then as the page loads, we need to assign our database. And we pass our connection string. So now that we have this, we can retrieve and display all employee records. Now the thing is that this is the same sort of thing that we were doing on the previous page. On the other page, I had put it in a separate method because we were reloading it a lot every time we did an insert or an update or a delete or a search. This time, I don't think we're going to be reloading it too many times. So I'm just going to keep it up in here for now, just to simplify things. One other thing that we're going to need to do is to load up the values for this department drop-down list. So now that we've got our database, not only are we loading the employees, but we're also loading the departments. Now this is a perfect example of where we would want to use an ordered list procedure, because all we need are the department codes for the search and the names so that we can display them nicely in the dropdown. We don't need all of the department information. So there's no point in loading all of the departments. All we need is that ordered list. It allows us to minimize the data that we're pulling from the database. It'll, shorten things up a little. Also, if we retrieved all the departments and tried to use that to populate the dropdown, we would have a lot of duplicates and or missing departments. So, it's important to think about what data that we need to retrieve. So our goal here is we want to retrieve and display all employee records, and we also want to retrieve department list to populate the combo box. Now, because we're worrying about filtering employees, we don't have to worry about any modifications to departments. So we'll only need to retrieve and populate that one time. All right, so let's do this one first. This is something that we covered in the last video. So I'm just going to pause the video while I put in that code to populate that combo box from an ordered list procedure. So you can see that it's the code the same from the last example where I have a list of key value pairs, and I've saying that the value is the display member and the key is going to be used to select. I did add one additional part right here that I'll talk about. I created another key value pair object that has nothing for the department code and displays to the user all departments. And this is for helping us bypass the filter, because in that combo box, if you select one of the departments, there's no way to select none of the above. So I add that in, and I put that in at the top of my list of departments. So now my departments list that had 4 departments in it now has this one up at the top. So when we bind it, we also have this all departments option, and when you choose it, the value for depth code is an empty string. And an empty string is exactly what we want to pass to our database to bypass that filter. So all these parts work together to allow us to bypass it. I put this in at the top of my list of key value pairs, and then I bind that over to the combo box, same way that we did before. Now the next part is very, very easy. We are going to create a list of employees, and we're going to call our new employee filter record, or method rather, that we called it filter employees. And you can see we have 4 input parameters, but the page just loaded. The user hasn't had a chance to fill out the filtering yet. We want to show everybody, and we know the way to show everybody is to pass empty strings. So I can pass 4 empty strings to this method, and then we're going to use that result to populate our list view. Okay, now one minor change that I'm going to make. This looks messy and is confusing for the user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my data library, and here's the method that I want to call, but I'm going to write an overload that acts as a helper method. I'm going to write another one, filter employees, that takes no parameters, so that I can provide that functionality. Actually, I'm just going to copy, it'll be faster. That takes no parameters, but behind the scenes, this is where we're going to hide that calling this thing with 4 empty parameters. So we can't get around it, but at least we can hide it from end users, where we call this, and it really returns this. You might think, well, why on earth would I bother to do this? If I write one that is an overload, this is our polymorphism at work. Now, whoever's using this code library says, oh, I can use this method 2 ways. I can pass a bunch of filters, or I can pass nothing. Now, behind the scenes, it calls the same method. I'm not saying write the same code twice. But once this is here, it allows me to do this. And this shows us we're filtering employees without passing parameters. The parameters are all empty. It makes it a nice addition to our code library, makes it sleeker and more user-friendly. Okay, now before I go any farther, I'm going to test my project and make sure that we're seeing all the departments in the dropdown and that we're seeing all the employees in the list view. So when we load it up, remember we've got to click on that employee search little text block there to get to our other page. And here's our other page. So here's our list view. It's showing all the employees. And our filter is clear, but you can see that all departments is selected. We've got the other 4 that are populated from the database. Each one of these has behind it its own department code. And we have a place to enter a last name. I've used a calendar date picker here so that we can enter some nice dates in this area. And we'll be able to click on search to submit these, and then reset. We'll clear them all out and reset the results. So let's code up the search button next. in the search button, we know that we're going to have to call on our filter method again. So let's put that part in there. But this time we want to pass those parameters. We've clicked on search. Presumably it's because we've filled out some or all of those filter options. So I'm going to pass the values that are selected from the drop-down, that are entered into the text block, and that are selected from those two calendar date pickers. Now, remember that in order to bypass, we need to be able to send empty strings in places of null. We don't want to send null. Now, with the drop-down, the combo box, we don't have to worry about that because there's only 5 viable selections. The all department ones is an empty string. It's not a null. The others all have department codes in them, so we're good there. A text box. If there's nothing in a text box, its text property is empty. It's not null, so we're all good there. But with the calendar date picker, if nothing is selected in that calendar, its date property is null. So we have to replace those nulls with an empty string. The other thing that we want to concern ourselves with is that the calendar date picker, the data type for that is not date time, it's date time offset. So we're going to have to pass those values from that calendar date picker as a short date string, because that's what our procedure is expecting. It's expecting a little string in place of a date. So we have to do a bit of work with the calendar. We have 2 values here that we want to set. So we need strings from the calendar date picker for the low date and the high date. And we want to say, if nothing is selected, use an empty string. If a date is selected, change it to a short date string. So let's see our calendar date picker. The low date one, we'll do that one first. To get its selected date, we go .date like this. But if we look at what type this thing is, it's a date time offset. So we want to turn it into a string that looks something like this. Or you might have slashes or, something that resembles a short date string. We want to send a string to the stored procedure. So I'm going to call this thing that could potentially be null. We're going to cast it to a date time offset. Now you might wonder, why am I casting something if I already said that it was a date time offset? Well, if you notice, it's actually a nullable date time offset. That question mark there, you might remember this from last term, it's a nullable. Now, we're going to write code to deal with what happens if it's null. So if we're trying to convert it to a date, presumably we already decided that it's not null. So I'm converting it to a regular date time offset to prove that it is not null. And then from there, I'm going to convert this thing to a string using typical .toString method. Now, when you convert a date time offset to a string, you get the date, the time, and the offset, which is, -5 hours GMT or whatever it might be. I don't want all that. I just want a short date. So you might notice when you call toString on a date time offset, you can provide all of these different format strings to indicate how you want to format it. And it even gives you some examples down here, which is really handy. So if we look for the lowercase d, we can pick out, day of the month. If we use it alone, though, down here, if the D format specifier is used without others, the D standard date and time format specifier. That is this. ToString D on its own gives us a short date. See? Like that. Okay. So we need our little if statement here that says if this thing is null. So let's move it over. If it's null, then we're going to set load date to an empty string. Else, we're going to set load date to this short date string that we got from the calendar date picker. I'm going to do the same thing for high date, but I'm going to do it with ternary logic instead of the if-else. So let's say this, high date equals a condition. If the high date is null, we're going to use an empty string. Otherwise, we're going to use this thing, but with the high date, not the low date. So if you're unfamiliar with ternary logic, it just replaced these 4 lines of code. You can see how either one will work, but this one is a lot more efficient looking. Okay, so we've got our low date, we've got our high date that we got from those calendar pickers. We had to deal with what happened if you didn't pick anything. Once that's all done, now we can do this job where we're going to pass those 4 values. So the first thing that we're passing is the selected value from the combo box. Remember, we need to pass the department code from the combo box, the last name from the text box, and then the low date and high date that we just made here. So let's get our department selected value, and we're going to get our txt last name.text, and we're going to pass low date and high date. Now, if we really want to make this thing awesome, what we're going to do next is make sure that the last name isn't longer than 30 characters so that it doesn't overflow our database input parameter. Over here, you can see how we've casted it to a string because the values are set as object. So we could do, better validation and things like that. Once we have this list, then we're going to assign it again as the source of the list view. And if we want to save ourselves some memory space, I can get rid of this variable emps and just assign it directly to the list view, like that. Save some time and trouble, saying the item source is the result of this method. Store it temporarily. We don't need it for anything else. So, if we were going to be clicking on employees and doing things to them, then yeah, we probably should store that record somewhere. But we're only using it to display it in this list view, so there's no point in storing it into a variable. All right, let's test it out. So we'll click on our employee search. It still works to show us everything. Let's try the combo box. Show me employees from information systems. It's looking pretty good. Okay, now I'm going to keep this filter there. Show me employees from information systems whose last name contains the letter O. Looking pretty good. We got rid of Ethan Black, but the other 3 stay. Now let's work on this filter here. We've got employees 1981, 84, and 90. So let's pick some dates between 1980 and 1985. That should get 2 of them. So there's January 1st, 1980. And I'll pick the end of 1985. So that should include Robert and Clara, but not Ned. And it looks like it's working great. Now the only other thing we need to do is code up the reset button, because we could reset the departments and we could reset the last name, but there's no way to unselect a date. You can't really delete it from there. So we need this reset button to reset our calendar date picker. So I'm going to code up the reset button that just resets everything. Now the easiest way to reset is just to redirect us back to this page, but that's really not in the spirit of good programming. So let's code it up to fix everything. So how can we reset the combo box? Well, I'm going to push it back up to that all departments option by saying that the selected index is 0. That selects the first option, which is that all departments option. We can reset the text box by saying the text of that is blank. We can reset the calendar date pickers, high date and low date, by setting the dates to null. Remember, that's what was the value of date if nothing's selected. So I'm going to make sure to do them in the correct order, though. CDP low date. So we set the dates to null to make sure that nothing is selected. And we're also going to reset the list view by calling that filter method with no parameters, which, as we know, just passes empties all the way to the database. So that will reset our list view back to showing everyone. We'll go ahead and try that out as well. So let's click Employee Search. We start by seeing everyone. Let's work on some filtering. If I choose a department that doesn't have any employees, notice there are no results there, which is different than choosing all departments, which shows everyone. Let's pick some different options here, and I'll pick some dates. If I choose people, I'm going too far back here, people hired between 1978 and 1991. Random date here at the end of November. So that encapsulates 2 of those people. When I click Reset, clear everything back out, show everybody again. So that's the end of this demonstration. Now you know how to dynamically filter the data set by writing a specialized stored procedure and then writing a method in our code repository that calls that stored procedure and passes the appropriate input parameters, and then creating a user interface so that the users can provide values for the required parameters that we need in order to perform the filtering. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that it is helpful to you. If you have any questions or concerns, as always, send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one.